The room was too quiet for a hearing. The kind of silence that doesn't come from order, but from assumption. Everyone expected civility, respect, mutual admiration. After all, Justice Stephen Breyer wasn't there to spar. He was retired, lauded, and uncontroversial. A pillar of institutional wisdom. And Jasmine Crockett, well, she was known for fire, for passion. But even she had said this was just a policy roundtable. Nothing more. But everyone underestimated one thing. What happens when someone who's mastered the system meets someone who's been crushed by it? The topic was judicial reform. The panel was diverse. Elected officials, retired judges, and scholars lined the oak table under studio lighting. Jasmine had her notes, her data, her lived experience. Breyer had his precedents, and decades of unshaken logic. It began politely. "Congresswoman Crockett," Breyer said, voice measured, "you've been a passionate voice for equity. But many have questioned whether your confrontational tone compromises the credibility of your message." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Justice Breyer, if truth sounds like confrontation, that says more about the room than it does about me." A soft ripple of reaction passed through the staffers behind them. Breyer gave a diplomatic nod. Then came the pause. And what followed wasn't written in any script. Breyer leaned forward slightly. "I ask this not as an attack, but as an observation," he said. "Some have raised concerns that your political positions are more performative than principled, particularly when certain personal aspects of your life, like your marriage, are notably absent from public discussion." The air snapped. No one moved. No one breathed. A scholar 2 seats down raised an eyebrow so high it disappeared into her hairline. A microphone clicked somewhere in the back, picking up every breathless second. He went there. Jasmine stared at him, not in rage, not in shock, but something colder. Sharper. Her spine didn't move. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Only her eyes hardened. "You want to talk about credibility," she said, voice as even as glass. "You're sitting in a room full of men who lied under oath, who wrote opinions that stripped women of rights, and you want to talk about my marriage?" Breyer didn't respond. He didn't need to. The damage was done, and the room knew it. "I'm not ashamed of what I don't share publicly," Jasmine continued, "because I know the difference between privacy and hypocrisy. But I'll tell you what I don't do. I don't hide behind robes and titles and call it respectability." The room was still. No rustling papers. No murmurs. Only the sound of a woman who had nothing to prove, and everything to say. She hadn't even begun yet. For a moment, Justice Breyer seemed frozen, not by fear, but by calculation. He was a man used to rooms that bowed to his age, his robes, his legacy. But this room, today, it tilted toward something else. Toward a silence that didn't respect authority, only truth. Jasmine didn't fill that silence right away. She let it stretch. Let everyone feel it. Then she leaned forward, not with rage, not with retaliation, but with readiness. "You want to know about my marriage," she said. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Let me tell you something, Justice." She didn't look at him. She looked past him. At the cameras. At the aides. At the young woman in the back row scribbling every word. "My husband is not a press release. He's not a pawn. He's not a campaign strategy. He's a man who held my hand the night I got death threats for standing up to people who looked like you but spoke a whole lot worse." A few gasps. One cough. And still, Breyer said nothing. "He's a man who stayed up with me till 3 a.m. when I read eviction notices sent to women with 4 kids and no backup plan. He didn't ask me to be less angry. He asked me what time we were showing up." Breyer blinked once. "Don't mistake my silence about my private life for weakness," Jasmine added, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. "I keep it private because it's sacred. Something this building," she swept her hand at the ornate panels of the hearing room, "seems to have forgotten how to honor." A rustle of approval somewhere in the back row. Staffers glanced at each other. Phones vibrated. Breyer finally moved, shifting his weight, sitting a little straighter. "I didn't mean to offend," he said, almost too softly. "You didn't," Jasmine replied. "But you reminded people watching that even the ones we admire can miss the mark. And that's why I speak, so young women in law school don't have to choose between telling the truth and being respected." Then she picked up her folder, slowly, deliberately, and opened to the first tab. Judicial hypocrisy and structural bias. "This wasn't personal until you made it personal, Justice," she said, eyes locked now. "Now, let's talk about whose silence hurt this country the most." The room didn't just shift. It cracked. And Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. Stephen Breyer had faced oral arguments from the most formidable legal minds in the country. But nothing in the Supreme Court had prepared him for the kind of silence Jasmine Crockett left behind when she spoke. Not rage. Not insult. Just the truth, peeled back without apology. And now she had her binder open. "There's a dangerous pattern in these rooms," Jasmine said, flipping a tab. "It's called selective scrutiny. You ask the loudest women to quiet down, but you let silent men get away with decades of damage." No one dared look at Breyer. Even he didn't interrupt. "Not now. Since we're talking personal," she continued, "let's talk about the decisions made from the bench, decisions that reshaped millions of personal lives. Roe. Voting rights. Protections gutted while the men behind the curtains claimed neutrality." She slid a document forward. "A court decision. Dated. Highlighted. You all called it judicial restraint. But I call it willful detachment from pain." A few feet away, a policy advisor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Cameras zoomed in. Twitter timelines blinked alive again. "I didn't come here to litigate my marriage," Jasmine said, her voice cutting clean. "But if you're going to open the door to personal character, let's walk through it fully. Let's talk about which marriages survived political scandals. Which men's missteps were called complicated, while women's strength is labeled aggressive." She leaned back slightly. "You want to talk image, Justice Breyer? I've never hidden. I've just never begged to be liked." The moderator, a nervous-looking Georgetown professor, finally cleared her throat. "Perhaps we could return to the reform proposals." Jasmine raised one eyebrow. "Oh, I'm reforming something," she said coolly. "But it's not just the courts. It's the lens through which power gets policed." Breyer opened his mouth, then closed it again. What was he going to say? That she was out of line? That she'd taken it too far? The line was gone. She had erased it. And all that remained was her voice, and the people behind it. From that moment forward, it wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning. Outside the room, clips were already flying. A 27-second snippet of Jasmine's line, "You want to talk image? I've never hidden. I've just never begged to be liked," was posted on X by a Hill intern. Within 12 minutes, it had 40,000 views. Within an hour, it would be on cable news. But inside the room, none of that mattered yet. Because Jasmine wasn't done. "You know what the public keeps asking me," she said, scanning the panel. "They ask, why are these hearings always so sterile? So abstract? So polite? And the answer is simple, because truth makes powerful people uncomfortable." She closed the folder. No need for it anymore. "Justice Breyer, with all due respect, you spent decades deciding what America should look like, without ever having to live in its hardest corners." She looked directly at him now. "You sat in robes. I walked into courtrooms where the ceilings leaked and the bailiffs rolled their eyes at my client before the hearing even began. I've held mothers after they lost custody not because they were unfit, but because they were poor." She paused, this time, not for effect, but for breath. Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched at the edge of the table. I've seen how the system dresses up cruelty in the language of order. Breyer's jaw tightened. This isn't just about one question. It's about the arrogance that some questions even get asked. Her tone sharpened. Would you ever ask a white male senator about his marriage in front of a panel of scholars and cameras? Breyer remained still. Didn't think so. The moderator tried to move forward again. If we could pivot now to structural proposals. We are talking structure, Jasmine cut in. This is the structure. The one where the powerful ask personal questions of women to discredit their arguments. Where legacy is used as a shield against accountability. Where decorum is a trapdoor for silence. No one interrupted her now. Not even Breyer. And for the first time in years, the former Justice of the Supreme Court was not the most powerful voice in the room. The balance had shifted. And the country was watching. Justice Breyer finally leaned in. Not to speak, yet. But because he knew now, this wasn't just a policy forum. This was a battlefield. And he had underestimated the force sitting across from him. You seem to be implying, he said slowly, carefully, that legacy is inherently corrupt. That experience on the bench disqualifies one from asking questions of moral integrity. Jasmine didn't blink. No, she replied. I'm saying some people build their experience on suffering they've never tasted. The moderator stiffened. The audience, half of them aides, half of them scholars, was locked in. No coughing. No scribbling. Just the sound of a microphone catching fire, one word at a time. You've handed down decisions that shaped generations, Jasmine continued. But I've lived under those decisions. I've felt them in housing court. In underfunded classrooms. In women's clinics that closed 3 weeks too early for someone who couldn't afford the bus last week. She stood up. Slowly. Not to grandstand, but to shift the gravity in the room. You want to talk about integrity? Let's start with remembering that the law is not neutral. It reflects the people who write it, and the ones who survive it. Breyer raised his brow. That's a strong statement. It's a lived one, Jasmine replied. She stepped to the side of the panel table and held up a single, dog-eared eviction notice. This isn't theory. This isn't some abstract discussion about judicial temperament. This is what's happening now, in my district, and in every zip code where law is a weapon dressed in paperwork. Someone in the back row whispered, "My God." Breyer tried again. Representative Crockett, you must understand, judicial questions about personal life are often used to measure public trust. Then maybe, Jasmine cut in, her voice sharp now, we should start measuring trust by whose life actually mirrors the public's. She stared at him, unflinching. You sat behind the bench. I sat across from clients who hadn't eaten in 36 hours. You were briefed by clerks. I was briefed by mothers crying in fluorescent-lit waiting rooms. And I promise you, what I learned about justice wasn't in a leather-bound opinion. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was transformative. Breyer sat back. Not defeated. But outmaneuvered. And in the eyes of the people watching, on-site and online. Jasmine had just done more than answer a question. She had rewritten the power dynamic. Outside the hearing room, clips were spreading like sparks in dry grass. Inside, Jasmine Crockett was igniting something much harder to contain, conscience. I get it, she said, her gaze now fixed not just on Breyer, but on everyone in the room. To some of you, this is uncomfortable. I'm not supposed to say these things. I'm supposed to smile, absorb the blow, and elevate the discourse. She exhaled slowly. But I didn't run for Congress to keep powerful men comfortable. A few staffers near the wall exchanged looks. Not sarcastic ones. Not amused. Stunned. Do you know how many black women have sat in courtrooms and watched their motherhood, their love lives, their faith be dissected in open air, while white men on the other side get labeled, flawed but brilliant? She stepped forward, past her seat now. Her tone was firm, but not angry. It was ancestral. I was raised by a woman who didn't have time to be soft. She worked nights and still ironed our clothes for school. No cameras caught that. No courts debated her integrity. But every day, she held this country up in ways no robe ever has. Breyer sat with his hands folded. Listening. Perhaps for the first time in a very long time. You say legacy matters, she continued. Then let's talk about the legacy of silence. The tradition of using tone to dismiss truth. Of asking women to smile through insult because that's what makes the men feel safe. The moderator tried to interject again. But the audience, real and digital, was already gone. They were with her now. Fully. In 13 minutes, this clip will be online, Jasmine said without looking at the cameras. Some will say I was emotional. Others will say I was unprofessional. But none of them will ask why a retired Supreme Court justice thought it was okay to question a sitting representative's marriage instead of her ideas. She turned back to Breyer. Her voice, at last, dropped to a whisper. You're not the villain, sir. But you played the role today. No one dared move. And in that suspended moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She became a shield for every woman ever asked, are you stable enough? Respectable enough? Quiet enough to be taken seriously? And the answer was now louder than any gavel. CNN broke the clip in under 30 minutes. MSNBC had it on loop by the hour. But Jasmine wasn't watching. She was still in the hallway, leaning against a cool marble pillar, gathering herself. Not because she was tired, but because she knew what she'd just done would follow her. Forever. Devon, her comms director, ran up. You've got to see this, he said, holding up his phone. Clips everywhere. TikTok. X, YouTube Shorts. Even Fox News had labeled the moment, Crockett confronts Breyer. But inside the Capitol, Jasmine was still processing. Back in the hearing room, the energy had shifted. The panelists were now speaking in cautious tones, checking their phrasing, choosing each word like it might become a headline. Breyer, meanwhile, hadn't left. He sat still, quiet, collected, but with eyes that showed something rare. Doubt. For a man who had spent decades handing down final judgments, he suddenly looked unsure. The moderator cleared her throat. Justice Breyer, would you like to respond? He tapped his pen once. Then said simply, I think I'll listen. Jasmine, now seated again, gave the smallest nod. Not triumph. Not smugness. Just acknowledgement. Because for the first time, listening was a decision. The rest of the panel continued, but it was background noise now. The real discussion, the one about dignity, power, and what questions we dare to ask in public, was echoing far beyond the wood-paneled walls. And outside, the world was reacting. One conservative columnist tweeted, I don't agree with Crockett's politics, but she reminded me what courage sounds like. A high school debate coach from Chicago posted, played her clip in class. Half my students cried. The other half asked how to run for office. And from South Dallas, where the lights still flicker and the waitlists for housing grow longer by the week, a grandmother named Miss Leona called Jasmine's office and left a message. I saw you today, baby, she said, voice trembling. And I never felt prouder to be from where we're from. The Capitol hadn't prepared for this kind of reckoning. And Jasmine? She wasn't finished yet. The press flooded the rotunda. Every network wanted a quote. Every outlet wanted a moment. Jasmine gave them none. She walked past the cameras like they weren't there. Because she knew what they really wanted, headlines, not healing. Behind her, Devon caught up. They're asking if you'll comment on Breyer's silence. Jasmine didn't slow down. Let them talk about his silence. I care more about who finally heard something. She headed straight to her office. No celebrations. No press hits. Just a closed door and a draft housing bill on her desk still waiting for her red pen. But the country wasn't moving on. Online, clips from the hearing were being translated into Spanish, Korean, Arabic. Civil rights groups reposted them with hashtags like #DignityOnRecord and #AskBetterQuestions. Even college professors were uploading syllabi with "The Crockett Doctrine" as a headline unit. In a panel that evening on PBS, a law professor from Yale said, "What we witnessed wasn't just a rebuttal. It was jurisprudence with a pulse." But inside her office, Jasmine sat quietly, rereading an email. It was from a woman in Baltimore. Subject line, "I left him." The message was short. "After 6 years of being told I was too loud, too angry, too much, I watched you stand there and say it with no apology. And I realized I could leave. Thank you." Jasmine closed her eyes. Not to cry. Just to breathe it in. Back on Capitol Hill, Breyer issued a statement, brief, curated, and cold. "I believe Representative Crockett's remarks reflect the complexity of today's civic discourse." But it rang hollow. Because while he polished language, Jasmine had spoken in scars. In stories. In stakes too high to flatten into discourse. She didn't need him to agree. She needed him to understand. And if he didn't, well, millions of others finally did. The next morning, newspapers across the country ran headlines that had nothing to do with bills or budgets. Crockett changes the rules of the room. Dignity isn't partisan, Crockett reminds us why. When power listens, a hearing that turned into history. But for Jasmine, none of that felt like victory. She still had one thing left to do. That afternoon, she took a short drive, no aides, no press, just herself and a folder in the passenger seat. She arrived at a small community center tucked behind a church in southeast D.C. Inside, the room was quiet, lined with folding chairs and 2 rows of women waiting to speak to a legal clinic. She didn't introduce herself as Congresswoman Crockett. She signed in under her initials, JMC, and waited just like everyone else. One of the volunteers recognized her. Whispered something. But Jasmine only smiled and said, "I'm here to listen." And she did. For 3 hours. Stories poured out. A mother fleeing abuse. A young girl facing eviction. A grandmother who lost her Section 8 after missing one phone call. Jasmine didn't interrupt once. She didn't give speeches. She wrote names. Circled issues. Took notes with the same pen she'd used in the hearing room. Because this was the point. Not the clips. Not the claps. The consequences. Meanwhile, outside that room, the political world kept spinning. Several House members, both sides, issued cautious statements, most of them dancing around the confrontation like it might bite them. One senator called it an unfortunate distraction. Another praised Jasmine's emotional courage, then immediately pivoted to tax reform. But online? The public wasn't dancing around anything. They were marching right into the fire Jasmine had lit. Hashtags like #JasmineWasAllOfUs began trending alongside testimonials. "I've never seen someone say what I've felt my whole life." She didn't just speak, she named what they always pretend not to see. Even comedians and cultural critics chimed in. On late-night TV, one host joked. Justice Breyer learned what happens when you try to cross-examine someone who's been cross-examined by life. But the most powerful moment came from someone who hadn't spoken at all during the hearing, Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She released a quiet, written statement. No press conference. No TV spot. Just this line. Representation is not about presence. It's about truth. Yesterday, truth was spoken. And suddenly, everything Jasmine had said wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. A week later, the headlines had cooled. The panelists had returned to routine. Justice Breyer had disappeared from public comment. But something had changed, and not just in the hearing transcripts. In a quiet hallway of the Capitol, Jasmine walked alone toward a closed committee room. No cameras. No reporters. Just the soft echo of her heels on polished floors. Inside, a working session on housing equity was underway. When she entered, a few heads turned, not with applause, but with quiet acknowledgement. The kind that means, you've said what others were afraid to. At the front of the room, a staffer handed her a folder. Inside, early drafts of new bipartisan legislation. At the top, a title scratched in pencil. Crockett Provision, Section 7, Anti-Discrimination in Federal Housing Oversight. She didn't smile. She underlined it once, slowly. Progress. But later that night, something even more powerful happened, off camera. She visited her mother. They sat on the same back porch where Jasmine once read textbooks under a flickering bulb, the same porch where they'd cried the night of the eviction, the same porch her mother always called our little throne. Her mother poured sweet tea. Looked at Jasmine like she'd never left that teenager behind. I saw the clip, her mom finally said. All of it. Jasmine looked down, unsure. Did I go too far? Her mother reached across the table, touched her hand. No, baby. You didn't go too far. You just finally brought us all the way in. Silence fell again. But not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that only comes when truth has finally been spoken, and heard. Back in D.C., editors wrote columns. Students printed quotes. Organizers stitched Jasmine's words onto banners and email footers. And somewhere in Ohio, in a trailer park outside Zanesville, a man named Ronnie turned up the volume on his old radio. He didn't catch everything, but he heard one line clear. I don't speak so they'll feel comfortable. I speak so y'all don't feel invisible. He turned off the radio, looked at the cracks in his ceiling, and whispered. She's talking about us. And she was. Because Jasmine's story wasn't just a response. It was a declaration. That dignity isn't earned, it's inherent. That silence isn't safety. It's absence. And that if you dare question someone's worth, you better be ready for the kind of truth that doesn't fit in a press release. The hearing ended. But the echo? It was just beginning. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak for attention. She didn't raise her voice to make headlines. She did it because someone had to. When Justice Stephen Breyer questioned something as personal as her marriage, what he underestimated wasn't her strength. It was her purpose. She didn't break down. She broke through. She reminded a room full of power that lived experience is not weakness. That truth, when spoken plainly, can shake even the most polished marble walls. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a reckoning. And it echoed from the Hill to every home that's ever felt unseen. So the next time someone tries to shame a woman into silence, remember Jasmine Crockett. And remember what happens when the mic is hers, and she chooses to tell the truth anyway.